Hello, welcome to News Year 2011. As always, there were several events that impacted on the lives of many and others that were just plain heartbreaking. The year began with an event that fell into both of those categories.
The year began with many areas of Australia facing a mammoth flood crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected, with the military ferrying urgently needed supplies to flood-stricken residents of central Queensland.
I expected it to be over the roof anyway, but it's just hard when you see it.
It's just unbelievable. I cannot believe that I've never had the privilege of living there. And what's going to be left of it? Nothing. We'll have to rebuild, I would imagine.
The government said it would speed up the time taken to assess asylum seekers because of an expected surge in the number of failed applicants seeking a court review. 2 new federal magistrates will also be appointed as part of the government's response to a High Court decision. New South Wales Premier Christina Keneally was jeered and heckled as she fronted the inquiry into the state's power sell-off. The Premier and her Treasurer were grilled over the $5.3 billion deal, with critics claiming taxpayers would never see a cent of the profit. Aged care providers welcomed a draft report calling for widespread reform of the industry. A productivity commission made bold recommendations to cater for growing demand for aged care provision. An internal customs review blamed bad weather for the fatal asylum seeker boat crash at Christmas Island. At least 30 people died when the boat ran onto rocks and broke up on December 15. And also in January, the federal government announced it would cut spending, delay projects and impose a one-off levy in order to pay for a huge flood damage bill. The inquiry into New Zealand's Pike River tragedy found the 29 men trapped in the mine died within minutes of the explosion.
A lot of us cried. And I'm still crying inside.
And the month ended with Egypt in crisis and stranded Australians being evacuated as the violence on the streets escalated. February began with North Queenslanders preparing for Cyclone Yasi. There was plenty of warning and residents scrambled to prepare themselves as best they could. When Yasi finally crossed the coast, it brought immense destruction to an area between Innisfail and Tully.
Just picture my house gone. It's not there anymore. None of my stuff.
This is the end of life. We all felt like that. None of us are handling it.
At the moment, you just get excited finding things that you didn't think you'd find.
One of the impacts was on produce, with the price of bananas doubling almost immediately. The second week of February began with an emergency in Western Australia. Bushfires around Perth would eventually destroy 72 homes. Fortunately, there was no loss of life. In the middle of the month, anti-whaling activists claimed a victory in the Southern Ocean, with Japanese whalers suspending their hunt. The Sea Shepherd group said the decision topped off its most successful season to date. On the 18th of February, the South Australian fishing community was rocked by the news of a shark attack off the Eyre Peninsula. 49-year-old Peter Clarkson never stood a chance after being attacked by 2 great whites.
The diver was attacked, dragged under the water, and there was nothing else sighted.
On the 23rd of February, New Zealand's second biggest city, Christchurch, was brought to its knees by a huge earthquake. The 6.3 shake struck at lunchtime, the epicentre 20 kilometres from the centre of the city. The scenes of destruction that followed were like nothing New Zealand had ever seen, and the death toll would eventually climb to more than 180.
These deaths are the greatest loss. They remind us that in the end, buildings are just buildings, roads are just roads, but people are irreplaceable.
March began with New Zealanders pausing for 2 minutes silence to remember those killed in the Christchurch earthquake exactly 1 week earlier. But rescue crews were straight back, combing through the rubble, looking for any signs of life. On the 3rd of March, taxpayers were informed they'd have to cough up an extra $1.8 billion to help rebuild Queensland. It followed the government securing Nick Xenophon's support for its controversial flood levy. On the 9th of March, gangland widow Judy Moran was found guilty of murdering her brother-in-law Des. 5 months later, she was jailed for a minimum 21 years. The following day, Prime Minister Julia Gillard moved the US Congress with an emotional speech in which she urged America to remain bold in tackling economic and security challenges. Prince William toured the quake-ravaged streets of Christchurch on the 17th of March, saying the scale of damage was unbelievable. On the same day, Professor Ross Garnaut called for a carbon price of between $20 and $30 a tonne during an address to the National Press Club. Australian Federal Police took control of the detention centre on Christmas Island on the 18th of March after a violent rampage saw part of the facility burned to the ground. During the third week of March, Brisbane's Lord Mayor was setting himself to take over the reins of the Queensland LNP. Within an hour of Campbell Newman announcing his intentions, party leader John Paul Langbroek decided to step aside.
Today I'm standing aside as leader of the opposition.
We need to deal with a very bad Labor state government.
On the 29th of March, Arthur Freeman, the man who threw his 4-year-old daughter off Melbourne's Westgate Bridge, was found guilty of her murder. After 5 days, the jury dismissed Freeman's claims that he was mentally impaired at the time.
The second quarter of the year began with one of the major political stories front and centre. At the same time, our military continued to face deadly challenges in Afghanistan.
April began with the impact of a carbon tax on household budgets becoming clearer. Secret government documents revealed the average household would pay more than $600 extra per year from price hikes in electricity, gas, food and petrol. Campbell Newman was voted in as the Queensland LNP's new leader just a day after resigning as Brisbane's Lord Mayor. He decided to try to win the safe Labor seat of Ashgrove.
I will campaign from now until whenever the election is, relentlessly, with you by my side.
A Melbourne driver had a lucky escape after driving her car off a multi-level car park in the city. The woman suffered only minor injuries after plunging from the 6th floor and landing in the alleyway below. In the first week of April, the Defence Force Academy was rocked by a sex scandal. A male cadet allegedly filmed himself having sex with a female colleague and broadcast it to 6 friends via Skype. The head of the academy was later stood aside. Melbourne man Arthur Freeman yelled out in court after being jailed for life for throwing his daughter off the Westgate Bridge. His non-parole period, 32 years. Despite protests, the former Navy frigate HMAS Adelaide was finally sunk off the New South Wales Central Coast. In mid-April, former water polo champion Kelly Lane was jailed for at least 13 and a half years for murdering her newborn baby Tegan. On the 27th of April, police in Victoria were investigating another wild brawl involving Melbourne's Sudanese community, the third in 3 days. The wave of violence followed a beauty pageant. In late April, the AFL announced the biggest TV rights deal in Australian sporting history. The deal between Foxtel and the Seven Network was worth $1.25 billion, with all matches to be shown live. May began with a major strike against terrorism. Nearly a decade after the September 11 attacks, US Special Forces killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in Pakistan.
We can say to those families who have lost loved ones to al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done.
On the 8th of May, former world bantamweight boxing champion Lionel Rose died aged 62. A day later, the Prime Minister announced a deal with Malaysia to swap asylum seekers for processed refugees. Under the deal, Australia would transfer 800 boat people for processing in exchange for taking 4,000 declared refugees from Malaysia.
While today's announcement is a step forward, I do want to say there are no easy fixes.
Treasurer Wayne Swan handed down his 4th federal budget during the month, the first under the Prime Ministership of Julia Gillard. While there were a few sweeteners and a few surprises, overwhelmingly the focus was on jobs and, as the Treasurer put it, creating a bigger and better Australian workforce. The government officially rejected the concept of a big Australia by releasing its population strategy. The report outlined a community-based approach to boost regional infrastructure and draw people out of overcrowded cities. The 18th of May saw the Prime Minister switch on superfast broadband on the Australian mainland. Tamworth in northern New South Wales had the honour of being first. The last combat veteran of the First World War was laid to rest in Fremantle. Hundreds of mourners gathered to celebrate the life of 110-year-old Claude Choules. In late May, Sergeant Brett Wood became the 24th Australian soldier to die in Afghanistan. The month ended with an Australian digger being shot and killed by a rogue Afghan government soldier, while another Australian was killed in a Chinook helicopter crash. June began with uproar in federal parliament. Finance Minister Penny Wong was interrupted with a cat meow during a Senate hearing.
Oh, yes. Why don't you meow when a woman does that? That's a good idea.
That led to claims of sexism from the government, and the argument boiled over in question time.
Senator Bushby has apologised to Senator Wong.
I made a comment which has caused offence, and I've apologised.
On the 8th of June, live cattle exports to Indonesia were suspended to all but 25 approved abattoirs. It followed a report featuring brutal treatment of cattle. In mid-June, air travel faced major disruptions caused by a volcanic ash cloud from South America. Many airports on both sides of the Tasman were affected. On the 16th of June, Simon Overland resigned as Victoria's police chief after a damning Ombudsman report found he released dodgy crime statistics shortly before the last state election.
Regrettably, I now find myself in a position where I believe it's in the best interests of Victoria and Victoria Police for me to no longer continue in that role.
In June, John Key became the first New Zealand Prime Minister to address the Australian Parliament, but his visit was overshadowed by the carbon tax debate. Family First Senator Steve Fielding snuffed out Tony Abbott's hopes for a national vote on the carbon tax. The senator rubbished the plebiscite as a political stunt. The British lord who compared the government's climate change advisor to a Nazi apologised for the slur. Tony Abbott distanced himself from Lord Monkton but refused to pull out of a mining conference where the renowned climate sceptic was a guest speaker. June ended with the Prime Minister announcing an additional $30 million in assistance to the live cattle industry. The hardship package was also designed to benefit businesses that rely on the live cattle trade.
Stay with us after the break, the second half of News Year 2011, where the Malaysia solution for asylum seekers dogged the government and women were set to play more of a defence role.